So thank you very much. Thanks for having me. So today I'm going to talk, my name is Benedikt Bünz. I'm the chief scientist at Espresso Systems, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do at Espresso Systems. And what we do is we build a fast confirmation layer. So at the end of the talk, you'll hopefully know what a fast confirmation layer is and what it is good for. And so the key problem that we're solving is composability. So what this means is that, if you have different applications, let's say Web3 applications, and they want to compose, so for example, one application wants to use another application, then they need to communicate. And this is really, if we think about what blockchains are about and why they're useful, composability is really at the heart of it, right? It's I can build an application and it can use all the assets that already exist on a blockchain. I can, use other smart contracts that already exist. And amazingly, the other applications or smart contracts don't even have to know that I exist, right? I can just add something to the ecosystem and suddenly everything works together beautifully. But in order to do that, these applications need to communicate with each other. And in order to do this efficiently, we need low latency. Low latency is really the key to enable these real-time interactions between applications, which in the end then trickles up to sort of everything from user experience to liquidity and everything beyond that. And this is what we're going to explore today. But let's make this even let's make this a bit more concrete, and we can actually look at even the connections between Web3 and Web2. So for example, let's see Coinbase receives a deposit of ETH, then Coinbase needs a message from Ethereum indicating that the transfer was complete, right? It also needs a way to confirm that the finality of this message. So it needs to know that this transaction is going to happen, but even more importantly, it needs to know that this transaction will never be reverted. Why is this important? Well, let's see it receives a deposit and then it executes, I deposit some funds to Ethereum, to Coinbase, and then I trade them. Then this trade has happened on Coinbase, right? It has happened, and maybe then even like the other person withdraws it, then this trade has happened, and Coinbase, if they don't want to go out of business, they better make sure that this transfer actually happened and will not be reverted. So this is really, really important for any interaction to happen. So when we talk about communication, speed matters, but integrity too. So communication must both be fast and reliable, right? So you want a fast answer to your question, did this transfer happen? But you also hope that sort of when someone tells you something, that they don't change their minds later, right? So the key questions here is what constitutes a reasonable trust assumption? Sort of when Ethereum says this transfer happened, like when can I trust this? And then the other way is how do I achieve, sort of the other question is, how do I achieve trust minimization such that, I can achieve the best speed while having the least amount of trust. So going back to kind of the blockchain example, the same thing applies to intra-chain messaging. So let's say I have, an account and I have some apps on the same chain. So if you have multiple apps on the same chain, they communicate via function calls. So that's immediate. And a single transaction could trigger multiple app changes, and all of them will finalize at the same time. So for example, I have some account, I might send some ETH to Uniswap, and then get some USDC back, right? So if I'm talking on one chain, then all of these application interactions, they can happen all within the same transaction, so they have zero latency. However, the same thing is not true. So even in the intra-chain messaging world. So nowadays there's many, many different chains. So let's assume, I have, so let's assume, this is the intra-chain messaging. But let's go to the challenges of intra-chain messaging. So let's say the communication between apps on different chains requires each of them to rely on some new trust assumption. So example one is, let's say I have an app on Ethereum that wants to read a message on an app on Solana. It must trust Solana's finality. Or let's say Coinbase, can't reorg its own state if an ETH deposit reverts due to an Ethereum reorg. So they really, really need to trust, Coinbase really, really need to trust all the chains that connect to it. So what does this lead to? It leads to Coinbase really, for example, setting very conservative parameters. So for example, if I deposit a fund from a rollup onto Ethereum, then, from a rollup onto Coinbase, then Coinbase waits usually, let's say an hour or something like this, until it confirms the deposit. So this is, sort of the world that we're moving. Why am I talking about interchain messaging? Well, the reason is because we have already moved to, and we're going to continue to move to, an interchain world. So a multi-chain world. And the term for it, today that people use are rollups. But I think in the future, sort of all of the applications that even are currently Web 2 applications, they will move onto chain. Sort of like you have some, let's say Robinhood in the US, or already has started to do this. They basically created a roll-up, so their own chain, as like an Arbitrum style stack, in order to make their application move from a Web 2 application to a Web 3 application. So in this multi-chain world, how does it work? Well, you still have a server that executes your application and proves the state, either through fraud proofs or through ZK proofs. And what they do is basically they post their transaction data onto the L1. And this has a couple advantages. So first of all, it shards the computation across applications. So for example, if OP, like let's say OP chain gets congested, then this doesn't directly affect the Arbitrum chain, right? And the other benefit is that it can have powerful nodes. So these servers can be extremely powerful nodes. They can help weaker nodes verify the state. So as a weaker node, I don't need to rerun the entire computation. I can just use these proofs, or I can just verify, these proofs, or trust these fraud proofs, and to ensure that what is happening on these servers was done correctly. And the third benefit that maybe isn't quite talked about as often, but I think is still an important one, is that today a lot of these roll-ups still run. They run, some version of the EVM. So you can post Ethereum transactions on there, but that isn't really necessary. And in fact, there are variants, stylus, where I can directly now code my smart contract in C++ or in Rust and run it sort of in a different type of VM. So you could have very different virtual machines running on each of them. So today these rollups are run by sequencers. So there's basically one centralized party that controls and runs the sequencer. And the problem with this is that the interoperability between apps across rollups is limited. So bridging, sort of the canonical example of that is bridging. So if I have funds on one rollup, it's an absolute pain to get it to another rollup. I first have to bridge it to the L1, and then I have to bridge it back to the L2. There is some, like I can use kind of I can ask a friend. I can basically trade my funds on one rollup to funds on another rollup, but that basically comes with costs, because that intermediary is sort of taking the risk. But all of this leads to liquidity fragmentation. So now basically users have funds on many different chains, and let's say a user has funds on one chain but wants to trade on a different chain, or wants to buy an NFT on a third chain, all of this suddenly becomes a lot more complicated. So we've scaled the computation. We've sort of solved these rollups that we solved, for a long time in blockchains. We kind of had an efficiency bottleneck, like you just simply couldn't do enough transactions per second. And we've kind of solved that with rollups, but we now have a different problem, that the liquidity is fragmented, and that now every app lives on its own chain and they don't interoperate well anymore. So apps across L2s on a shared L1 can communicate via the L1 without new trust assumptions, but unfortunately this has high latency. So what this means is basically the canonical example is I can bridge. So I can bridge to the L1, and then from the L1 I can bridge back to another L2. But this takes a long time. Why does this take a long time? Well, it takes a long time because basically these rollups, they only very infrequently checkpoint on the L1. Why do they do that? Well, that's their whole point, right? The whole point is that they aggregate transactions and save costs in order to make the transactions cheaper on the road. What's even worse is that most of these rollups today are so-called optimistic rollups, and the most performant ones are optimistic. And for optimistic rollups, the settlement time is actually up to 7 days. So it's a really, really long rollup. I don't want to go into the details, but it's just sort of fundamentally how they work. They basically, work by waiting for, a judgment period to be settled. And judicial systems, as we know, are slow. Same thing on the blockchain. So you have to wait 7 days. So, and then finally, the final problem is that Ethereum itself takes a long time to settle. So Ethereum, in the worst case, can take up to 15 minutes for a transaction to become final. So before 15 minutes, it's not safe to accept an Ethereum transaction. So there is a superpower, though, of these L2s, which is that they have very fast so-called soft finality. So what I can do at a very high level is that I can just ask the sequencer, well, what are you going to do, right? So the sequencer creates these transactions, controls the server, and it posts its state and it does all of these complicated things. But I could just, if the sequencer is my friend, then I can ask the sequencer, like, hey, what are you going to do? What is the next transaction that is going to happen? Even further, the sequencer can give me promises. It can say, like, I'm going to do X. Like, if you pay me, I'm going to include your transaction in the next block. And this can really operate on a millisecond basis, right? The communication to the sequencer is just the communication to the server, and this can be incredibly fast. However, if you may guess, right, like there may be sort of this power is this fast finality. So wallets and apps and chains, if they trust the sequencer, then they can, everything can operate super fast. And you could even have fast composability between applications if sort of everybody trusts the sequencer. However, as you may already think, this has some, this trust is a big word here. And in fact, right, what does this trust mean? Well, it means that the sequencer is honest. And you may say, like, well, in reality, these sequences are run by reputable companies, something like Arbitrum or like Off-Chain Labs or by OP. But it's not just that they're honest. It also means that they won't get hacked, right? And we'll dive into that in a second. And secondly, I need to trust that the L1 is safe so that the L1 block never reworks, which maybe is a more reasonable assumption, but still like. Let's say, here's an example. Unfortunately, this is how it could work, but there's a good reason for why it doesn't work that way today, is you could have sort of less than 1 second USDC bridging via these trusted sequencers, where essentially, let's say, the Arbitrum sequencer trusts the Optimism sequencer, and the Polygon sequencer trusts the Arbitrum sequencer, and you can immediately sort of mint and burn transactions and USDC, and basically Arbitrum will give you, I guess here the difference is the fees. So they will tell you, I'll give you 4 coins, on USDC as long as you've, or I'll mint 5 coins as long as you've burned sort of the right amount of coins on the other chain, and you could immediately do this message passing and send funds around in less than a second. So why does this not work? Well, it is exactly this, sort of this worry about sequencers getting hacked. So a trusted sequencer, even one by, run by a reputable company, could very much get hacked. And a temporary, if we sort of, trusted these sequencers, which fortunately or for good reasons we don't, then a temporary hack of any sequencer could cause extreme damages, right? So why is that? Well, essentially the hacker could freely mint USDC, right? It could say like, well, I've received a message from another sequencer. I'm going to, or it could, tell like let's say the Arbitrum sequencer is hacked. It could tell the Optimism sequencer, hey, please mint, 1 million or 1 billion USDC immediately, and the Optimism sequencer has no way of distinguishing whether it's talking to sort of, grandma sequencer or wolf sequencer. Oops. So, is this a real worry, right? I mean, it's like these are reputable companies. Can they just secure their server? Well, if you've been paying attention to the blockchain space, and this goes back, I stopped here in 2001, but really you can go back to like Mt. Gox in, I don't know, 2015 or something like this. This goes back through the entire history of blockchains. There's always, these single points of failures, which are centralized servers, and at some point they get hacked, right? And they get hacked for multi-hundreds of millions of dollars, like really devastating losses. And sequencers are sort of the next, if we put too much trust in a single entity, like a bridge or an exchange, then they will get hacked. So if we were to put too much trust into an L2 sequencer, I can tell you, at some point one of them would get hacked. If like now it would be good to see the audience, but sort of if people, you can wonder if so who does this hacking? Well, it turns out actually right now the main person or the main people who do this hacking is North Korea. So North Korea has like a state-sponsored hacking program where people they hire like their agents sort of contribute to open source projects. They pose as being like open source software developers, and they actually do some real contributions. But then they also contribute basically little backdoors to open source projects, and that's how a lot of these hacks have happened. So really, really sophisticated attacks that are multi-step, and and this is how North Korea gets a lot of their foreign currencies, is by hacking these crypto systems. Kind of crazy, but that's the world that we're in. So the other problem with it is, you might say, okay, well, I'm just going to trust, like each sequencer probably has a small independent chance of getting hacked. The problem is basically that the more sequencers that I have, the higher the probability goes. So, this is kind of a loose bound, but like basically if each, if I trust 10 sequencers and each of them has a 1% chance of getting hacked within the next 5 years, then that's already a 10% chance, right? And The more sequences I trust, that I need to trust, the more interconnection I want to have. And as we said, we're going to a multi-chain world, the worse this would get. So what can we do? Well, we could basically, what we really want is for sequencers to commit to what they're going to do, right? Like all of these attacks, how do they look in practice? Well, really what they look like in practice is that the sequencer says, I'm going to do one thing, like a hacked sequencer says. I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to burn some USDC, but then really it does something else, okay? So they are, they said they were going to marry you, but then, a couple of months later, they break off the engagement. So that's what an evil sequencer does. So what we really need to do is we need to harden their commitments. And how can we do this? Well, we can use consensus. So what we can do is basically that the sequencer can immediately sort of stream transaction batches to a layer 1.5, and this is exactly what we've built at Espresso. So this is the Espresso network, which runs on hundreds or thousands of validators. And all that this network does, all this layer 1.5 does, is say, I've seen these transactions. I've seen them in this order. I've timestamped them. And then later on, this could be an hour later, it can now even be much later. It's now the sort of urgency is much less. The sequencer will post its state on the layer 1, for example, including a bridge contract. And then the layer 1 needs to check consistency with the confirmation from Espresso network. So with the confirmation from this layer 1.5. So it needs to say that, so it's a modification of the smart contract where the sequencer basically has previously committed to doing X, and then the layer 1 checks, well, did you get a certificate from the layer 1.5 that you actually, and only then I'm going to accept your transaction. Oops. So this layer 1.5 is a fast confirmation layer. So now, basically, now every single application, so let's say rollup B, wants to now do this application where it receives some USDC funds, it burns these 5 coins and mints 3 other coins. It now can safely accept these messages if and only if it is a transaction or it's a message that was finalized on the 1.5. And importantly, we said well, now you might think that you might think well, you've just reinvented this layer 1.5. Why would it sort of fundamentally be faster than the layer 1? Well, it turns out that the layer 1.5, first of all, we can architecturally make it different than the layer 1, but also it doesn't need to execute any of the transactions. All you need to do is to finalize the order of transactions. So all I need to do is to know what transactions are going to come in what order. And once I know this, rollup B can actually just compute, or the sequencer for rollup B can actually just execute on itself very quickly. Well, what does the message from rollup A be? What does the message from rollup A mean? So the layer 1.5 can really be kind of a dumb consensus that all it does is it says, I've seen this stream of transactions. Or you can also be supported by CK proofs or trusted TEEs. So there's basically a lot of, we've kind of separated the execution of the transaction from the consensus of the transaction. And this turns out that it can make things much, much faster and much lower latency. So the L1.5 superpower is fast confirmations. It's exactly the same superpower that the sequences have, but now it's secured by a consensus. So the consensus ensures that these transactions on the layer 1.5 never reoccur. Exactly how sort of the technical details here not too important. So the risk difference with shared consensus is that when I trust a cluster of sequencers, sort of, when I trust the cluster of sequencers, then the protocol is compromised if any of the sequencers is hacked. So the risk grows linearly with the cluster size. The bigger I make my cluster, the better. And the difference is, in a shared consensus, I have security unless 33% of the validators are compromised. So what this means is, the bigger the cluster is, the lower the risk is actually, right? So the bigger the clusters, the more nodes would need to get compromised. So if I have 100 nodes, then 33 or 34 would need to get compromised. If I have 200 nodes, then it's 67 that would need to get compromised, and so on and so forth. So in one setting, in sort of the trusting the sequencer world, the risk grows with the number of the cluster, and in the shared consensus world, it decreases with the size of the cluster. That's really the power of the shared consensus. So to wrap up, and then maybe there are some questions. So Espresso Network, we've built this layer 1.5. It's really fast, and right now the consensus takes a couple of seconds, but we're actively working on getting to sub-second finality, such that then you can accept these transactions in under a second, and we're actively doing improvements and working on that. And it's live on mainnet. So right now it's secured by 100 distributed nodes. But we want to add some economic security, so we will transition to proof of stake in November. So very, very soon, basically in 2 months. This is going to be the big transition. Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, please let me know if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Benedikt. That's your applause.